Hey y'all, welcome back to Rogue Trotting. Today you'll be watching part 2 of our 3-part series on sex and sexuality in Denmark versus the United States. For this, it's been fascinating to have conversations with 2 experts in their fields, Jenna and Camilla over at Copenhagen University, who talked to us all about sex and sexuality in Denmark and America.
And in today's video, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into particularly sex education, so how schools educate children about sex as they come through the various school years, and also a little bit of advice for cross-cultural relationships. So it's all about education today.
Hi, my name is Jenna Strizzi. I'm a PhD in psychology of sexuality from the University of Almeria in Spain, and I'm also a Master of Sexology from the same university. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Copenhagen, and I've been dedicated to the scientific study of sexuality since 2006.
I am Camilla Uvrup, and I am originally a Dane, but moved to the US and lived there for 13 years. During that time, I received my PhD in social psychology from the University of Houston with a focus on intimate relationships. I am a postdoc here at Copenhagen University, and study sexuality and romantic relationships.
Now, the first topic we're going to look at today is on sex education, and I have to say this is one of the topics I'm most excited for because obviously we can speak to sex education in the US in the 90s, have no idea what it was like for Danes during the same time. So really curious what they have to say about that.
Yeah, and we also don't know what it's like now in either country. No. So this was a really cool topic to discuss with our experts. So let's roll the tape and see what we find out.
50% of the US states mandate sexual health education, and of them, only 13 require that the information that students and children are receiving is medically accurate.
That's
scary numbers.
Very scary.
Yeah.
So only 50% of states
mandate that require for there to be sexual health education. And then only 13 states of 50 states mandate that have a requirement of that it be medically accurate. So we're doing a huge disservice to our children. Yeah. We have an obligation to provide medically accurate education.
Yeah, you would think, just by definition. You would think that you wouldn't even need regulation like that.
Yeah. What's interesting though is that so we generally perceive Denmark to be much more progressive when it comes to sex and openness about sex, but even in Denmark, sex education isn't a given, and the quality of it is far from necessarily high standards. There are movements, as of, I believe last year, there was a political movement to push more money into securing quality sex education in primary schools. And the idea is that kids should learn and talk about sex and related topics from kindergarten through the end, through 9th grade.
Right.
So there is a movement, but again, there's always variability in quality.
Denmark has had, they started teaching sexual health education in the 1800s. Then it's been mandated for 50 years that it's a requirement for sexual health education. But there's an article that was published in the Journal of Sex Education that did an evaluation of the sexual health programs that are offered. And the people who teach sexual health education aren't specialists. So they don't receive, they're the normal teachers, which can provide some advantages because these are people that have been working with the children so they're comfortable. The kids might be more comfortable talking about the sexual issues with them, but they also might be less comfortable if they're questioning their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Having those conversations with someone that they know they might not be comfortable because the teachers haven't received training in sexuality. There is material that's really good material available to them, but they're not required to use it. So teachers can prepare their own material and teach based on their own ideas. And that can be problematic.
My sex ed teacher in primary school in Denmark was my biology teacher. Yeah, it was not a good fit.
Yeah, I know in the US it's a bit similar where it's usually a phys ed teacher. So the same person who is teaching you how to play volleyball is also teaching you about your reproductive health, and that may not be a perfect solution.
No. And it's really important that people in giving sexual health education be well trained in these topics and be able to talk about sexual issues in ways that aren't communicating their own biases. Because that can be how, it's not just the messages that are conveyed, but how the messages are conveyed to young people can have really important implications, especially for children that are questioning their sexual orientation or their gender identity. If you have a severely transphobic or homophobic teacher who's giving these messages, but in a way that you can tell where their biases lie, that can really be negatively affect young people.
Sure. Yeah. So it seems like there's no perfect plan in place in either country, but
there's more an intent, at least.
More of an intent in Denmark.
Yeah. My sexual health education in the United States was baby think it over. So it was a robot baby that cries, and we were assigned to take care of this baby, this robot baby, and have a pacifier, and put a pacifier in his mouth every time it cried. It was just programmed to randomly cry at random hours, and take it with us like soccer practice in this little carrier. And
all it required was a pacifier.
Right. So we were like 11, 12 years old, and that was our sexual health education, that reproduction is embarrassing, that it's public shaming.
Right.
Those are terrible messages to learn about sexuality. And there's a really interesting project happening right now from Dr. Kristen Mark from the United States called the Abstinence Project. And it's collecting narratives about Americans' experiences with abstinence-only sexual health education and how that's negatively impacted their sexuality. That abstinence-only education, the science is clear, it does not work.
But there's a political will for it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so really interesting to learn a bit more about sex education in both countries. And I guess the one takeaway is that it's not perfect in either country, and some of the same problems exist in both.
Yeah, I can totally get the story about how you have somebody who's an older teacher trying to explain things to younger people and projecting their views as opposed to science on there. I think that's a really interesting point, is kind of taking sex education from just a teacher putting together a curriculum to a very structured thing that has a lot of science behind it. I think that's a really fascinating thing to see.
Yeah, before I talked with Jenna and Camilla, I really thought that Denmark would have a little bit more of that figured out and some of those biases wouldn't be in there. I mean, it's good that 100% of students do receive some sex education, unlike in the United States, but I was a bit surprised that there were really no controls on making sure that no biases snuck in there.
Yeah, it was also fun to hear that somebody else had baby think it over for 24 hours. I definitely didn't get much sleep that night.
Yeah, we didn't do that at my school, but at least we both had sex education and we weren't in one of the states that don't offer that.
That's true.
Yeah.
Let's talk about education for younger kids, and we also talked to them a little bit on advice for adults dealing with cross-cultural relationships, because obviously all of the sex education rolls itself up into how adults act around sex and sexuality.
Yeah, and if you are in a cross-cultural relationship, or you're just interested in what it's like dating somebody cross-culturally, we recently did a video on this, and we'll put a link to it on the end page so that you can watch that next. But it was really cool to ask them for some advice, so let's see what they said.
Okay, so, as people who have lived in both cultures, the US and Denmark, what advice would you have for anybody in any terms of adapting to sex and sex culture in both countries?
I think my first one would be to be aware that dating scripts and sexual scripts vary vastly between the two countries. It can be interesting to come from one country to the other and have an expectation of what dating or sexual relationships are like, and they're not what you think they're going to be. Procedures, expectations vary vastly.
I would say to a Danish person dating an American to be aware that most Americans were raised in an environment where sex is surrounded by stigma and shame. And that is likely to impact their experiences with sexuality. Mm-hmm. And that's, so just to be conscious of that and kind and understanding to that upbringing can carry across life course. And that for Americans dating Danes, that their raised environment, their experiences and education about sexuality is likely when it's natural and open and just a part of life. In the sexist study, most Danes believe that sexuality is an important part of their lives, and enjoying sexuality is an important part is important to them. So that this mismatch could lead to misunderstandings, but through open communication and discussing what those experiences are like, it's easily overcome.
Yeah, culture clash is always there, but communication is the
key.
antidote. Yep.
Yep, that's the silver bullet. Education and communication.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so I think the main takeaway from that is that if I'm American and dating a Dane, don't judge me for the crazy country that I come from, because I can't help it.
And honestly, vice versa.
Exactly.
I think that's the main lesson here.
Yeah. So all relationships are challenging, cross-cultural relationships are no different, but it all comes down to communication and not judging one another too harshly. So...
Well, speaking of communication, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on these topics here. Be sure to leave comments below. We'd love to hear what your experience and your thoughts are as it comes to these really interesting topics.
Yeah, so jump in the comments, let us know what you think, and we'll see you back here for part 3, where we're going to close out this awesome series on sex in Denmark versus sex in America.